Hey everybody, welcome back. If you've been following along, you might have seen a comment on one of my earlier videos asking if I could show some real examples of how PowerShell integrates with IAM. So I'm going to focus on the practical and break this into two parts. This first part is about building an Active Directory environment and using PowerShell to do real IAM tasks in it. Things like creating users, managing groups, assigning access, and handling the day-to-day account lifecycle. Along the way, we're also going to touch on how PowerShell goes beyond just managing what's inside the directory. It also is the automation layer that organizations use to connect AD to other identity systems, which is where our part two kind of comes in. We're going to take what we build here and then sync it to the free Entra ID tenant from an earlier video that we are already done using Microsoft Entra Connect. That's going to show us how identity flows from a local directory into the cloud, simulating basically how hybrid environments actually work in production. So the slides are going to be linked in the description and also in the comments below on TikTok, so they're easy to grab. Every click is going to be laid out for you, so just follow along at your own pace. Let's get into it. So what are we learning here? Basically the same stuff that IAM professionals do every day. How to set up a directory, how to create users and groups, how to give people access through group membership, and how to handle things like password resets and account lockouts, all with PowerShell. By the end of this video, you're going to see how a directory and the commands that manage it work together and how that is really the base that everything else in IAM is built on. The details of what we're building today are on the slide, so everything is free and it runs all inside a virtual machine, so your computer never actually is touched. Now, let me just walk you through what your machine needs before we start downloading anything. So, in terms of hardware, you're going to need a 64-bit CPU, enough disk space for at least one VM, and internet access. If your laptop only has resources for one VM, build the server. That is where Active Directory and PowerShell live, so it covers everything that we're going to need for the IAM portion of this lab. Now, the client VM is going to be useful for domain testing, but as I mentioned, it's going to be optional. With that covered, let's look at what we need to download. There are four links on this slide. VirtualBox is the hypervisor that's going to run our virtual machines. Windows Server 2022 has two links, the evaluation page and a direct path to the ISO download, and then optionally the Windows 11 Enterprise evaluation if you want the client VM later. All the links are clickable and available in the presentation linked below. So once you have those, we can start building. First thing is getting VirtualBox installed. Installing VirtualBox is pretty quick, and the steps are all on the slide. So for anyone not familiar with it, I'm just going to explain. VirtualBox is what is called a hypervisor, which means it lets us run an entire operating system inside our laptop as a virtual machine. The reason that matters for us is that our whole lab is going to live inside these VMs. Your actual computer stays completely untouched, and if something goes wrong or you want to try a different approach, you can just delete the VM and rebuild from scratch. That is what makes a home lab like this a safe environment to learn in. One note though, if you get an offer for the extension pack, you do not need it for anything we're doing here, so don't get it. Um, Nonetheless, with VirtualBox installed, we need the operating system that's going to run our directory. That operating system is Windows Server 2022. The reason we need it specifically is that the Windows Server that runs Active Directory is this version, all right? And Active Directory basically is the directory service that stores identity objects that we're going to create throughout the lab. So users, groups, computers, organizational units, security policies, all of that is going to live there. Without a directory running, there's going to be nothing for PowerShell to manage, so this is the foundation of basically everything that we're doing. One thing to keep in mind for later, when you get to the actual install, Microsoft gives you two options: Server Core, which is the command line only, and Desktop Experience, which gives you the full GUI. Please pick Desktop Experience. Being able to see objects you're creating both in the graphical tools and PowerShell at the same time is really helpful when you're learning how those two connect. With the ISO downloaded, we are basically almost ready to create the VM, but there is one networking step inside VirtualBox we need to handle first. That networking step is creating a NAT network. Networking trips people up early in HomeLab builds, so let me explain kind of why we're doing this. A domain controller needs to be reachable on a network. Clients need to find it to authenticate, look up users, and join the domain. A NAT network in VirtualBox creates a private network that our VMs share so they can communicate the same way machines on a real office network would. It also gives them internet access, which we need for Windows activation and updates. Now, the reason we don't just use the default NAT mode is because it gives each VM internet but does not let the VMs talk to each other. That would be a problem the moment we try to join a client to the domain. So, setting up a NAT network avoids that entirely and takes about 30 seconds. Steps are on the slide above. So, with networking in place, now we can actually create the server. Creating the VM is straightforward, but the full steps are on the slide. The thing worth calling out is the name. We are naming it DC01 because this becomes our domain controller. And that matters because once Active Directory is installed, the computer name gets baked into the DNS records, service principal names, and replication metadata. Changing it after promotion is a much bigger process, so getting it right now saves you some trouble later. The other key piece is making sure that the network adapter is pointed to the NAT network we just created. Everything else, like RAM, disk size, and attaching the ISO, is on the slide. So, with the VM configured, let us boot it up and get Windows installed. Now, the install itself is a standard Windows setup, and the clicks are all on the slide. The only decision that matters is picking desktop experience, which we talked about earlier, so you get the full GUI. At the end, it asks you to set a local administrator password. This is worth paying attention to because it is the only account on that machine right now. So there are no domain accounts yet. So this is what we're going to use to log in and set up Active Directory. Hang on to that password, all right? So once Windows is up and you're signed in, there are a few things we need to clean up before we touch Active Directory. The cleanup is pretty quick. We rename the server to DC01, which we want to do now before Active Directory is installed because the computer name becomes part of the domain's identity after promotion. We also run Windows Update so we're not dealing with pending reboots in the middle of configuring AD. And we make sure the VM has internet connectivity because Microsoft's evaluation versions need to activate within 10 days or they start shutting themselves down. The steps are on the slide here. So with the servers clean, updated, and properly named, we now build the directory. Building the directory basically starts with installing a role called Active Directory Domain Services. This is what turns a regular Windows server into something that can actually manage identity. Once it's installed, the server can store and organize user accounts, security groups, organizational units, and policies. When you hear people say Active Directory, this is the piece that they're really talking about. So now installing this role gives the server the ability to manage identity, but it is not actually doing it yet, okay? Think of this as loading the engine. The next step is where we turn the key. Turning the key is promotion. This is where our server becomes the authority for a brand new domain called corp.lab. After this, the server is not just running Active Directory, it owns the directory. Every authentication request, every identity lookup, every policy evaluation goes through it. When a user logs in anywhere on the domain, this is the machine that validates their credentials and determines whether they're allowed to do or go in. So we are standing up DNS during this process because Active Directory depends on it. Clients use DNS basically to locate the domain controller. So without it, nothing on the network can really find the directory. Once the server reboots, we're logging into a domain controller, and everything from here on is IAM work. But before we start creating anything, let us make sure the whole thing is actually running. To verify, we run the 4 commands on this slide. The first one loads the Active Directory module into PowerShell. Think of it as turning on the connection between PowerShell and the directory. Every IAM command we use from here on needs that module loaded. The next 2 check that the domain and the forest are healthy. And the last one pulls back user accounts that already exist in the directory, like the built-in administrator account, just to confirm we can actually read what is in there. So if all 4 come back clean, PowerShell and Active Directory are talking to each other, and we have a working identity environment. The lab setup is done. Everything from here forward is IAM. So first thing we are creating is an organizational unit called sales. An OU is how Active Directory structures where objects live. In a real organization, you might have OUs for departments, office locations, or business units. They can also serve as boundaries for group policy, so you can apply different security settings to different parts of your directory. Worth noting that when we set up Entra Connect in part 2, we can scope the sync to specific OUs. So the structure you build now directly affects what ends up in the cloud later. Inside that OU, we create a security group called sales users. The reason we start with a group that is in an enterprise IAM, you almost never assign permissions directly to a user, okay? You assign permissions to groups and then control access by managing who is a member. That separation between the person and the permission is what makes IAM scalable. So now we have the structure, we just need to put a user into it. This is where we provision our first user account. The provisioning is one of the most fundamental IAM tasks there is, all right? When an organization brings on a new employee, a new contractor, a new vendor, this is what happens at the directory level. A user object gets created with a name, a login identity, a password, a location in the directory, and an enabled status. The command is on the slide, and every parameter in it maps to something in a real provisioning workflow. The SAM account name is the legacy login format. The user principal name is the modern format that looks like an email address and is also the format Entra ID uses when this account syncs to the cloud. The path determines which OU the account lives in, and the enabled flag controls whether the account can authenticate immediately. In production, these fields often get populated automatically from an HR system or a ticketing workflow, and PowerShell is the automation layer that connects those systems to the directory. The user exists now. The next question is, what can they actually access? Access into Active Directory comes from group membership. One command puts our user into the sales users group, and whatever permissions are tied to that group now apply to them. That is the connection between identity and access. The user object represents who someone is, group membership represents what they can do. PowerShell is what kind of manages the relationship between those two things. The reason this model works is that it scales. You do not reconfigure permissions every single time someone joins a team. You add them to the group, and then the access follows. When they move departments, you swap their membership and permissions update everywhere else automatically. And when this syncs to the Entra ID, those memberships come with it. So cloud access can be governed by the same groups you manage locally. So we can have a provisioned user and assign their access, but IAM doesn't stop at onboarding. There's a whole set of day-to-day operations that usually come after. Those day-to-day operations are what the commands on this slide cover, okay? Password resets are probably the most common help desk request out there. Disabling accounts is what happens usually when someone leaves an organization, and that needs to happen quickly because a former employee with active credentials is usually considered a security risk. Now, re-enabling is usually for someone who returns or was disabled by mistake, and unlocking is for the account lockouts, which trigger when someone enters the wrong password too many times and the domain's lockout policy kicks in. What ties all of these users together is that they are the account lifecycle. Provisioning gets someone in, group membership gives them access, and these commands manage what happens to that account from that point forward. And a lot of organizations, these get automated with PowerShell scripts that pull from ticketing systems or HR feeds. What we are doing manually here is the same logic that runs behind those workflows. That covers the core IAM work for this lab. Everything from here forward is about the optional VM client. So if you don't want to do that part, you can go ahead, skip to the end. Okay. So if your laptop has the resources, you can build a Windows 11 VM and join it to corp.lab. The reason this is valuable is that it lets you see the other side of everything we kind of just built. The domain controller manages the accounts. The client is where someone actually logs in with one of those accounts and experiences the access that was assigned to them. So you get to test that the identity work you did with PowerShell actually functions from a user's perspective. This will be more of a focus in part two, but the steps are on the slide if you want to get ahead. Now, for anyone who did build the client VM, this slide walks through the actual domain join. Joining a machine to the domain means it trusts the domain controller for authentication. Once that's done, you can log in as any user you created and see the access you configured with PowerShell working from a user's perspective. Now, before we wrap up, let me cover some of the common things that can kind of go wrong. Most problems that people run into come down to a few things. VM won't start. That's usually virtualization being turned off and biased. No internet in the VM. Check that it's on the right NAT network for that one. 80 commands not working. Make sure you are in PowerShell and not in command prompt. They look very weirdly similar, so just make sure you're in the right area. The rest of the common fixes are pretty much on the slide. If you hit something that's not covered here and you're really having a problem, either DM me or just post a comment in the link below. Um, More than happy to answer it. So, coming back to the original question, how does PowerShell integrate with IAM? We just built the answer. We stood up an Active Directory environment and used PowerShell to create the organizational structure, provision a user, assign access through group membership, and manage the account lifecycle. Those are not theoretical examples. Those are the same tasks that happen in a real IAM operations every day. All right. This is part one. In part two, we are going to be taking what we built basically and connecting it to the Entra ID using Entra Connect, which is free. So the users, groups, and OUs we just created will sync to the cloud, same identity, same structure, basically extended into that hybrid environment. And that's going to be the full answer to this question, which is just that they function in a like PowerShell functions there in quite a few different ways, mainly from a this is how we manage like the local access for certain things because sometimes you have a cloud and then you have a local thing that manages specific accounts or specific groups. And you can use it to manage that stuff. So sometimes it's the language that you're using to interact with the database and the structure itself. And then other times you're using PowerShell to kind of almost Frankenstein Jimmy rig, where one information or database kind of connects to the other. And that's really all identity systems are at their core are databases that are focused on identity. You're identifying things and pulling things based on like a number or a lookup. So last slide here. This is basically all the references that I've used to make this stuff. Every link is clickable, and just a reminder again that all of the slides here are linked in the description and in the comments below on TikTok. So if this helped, let me know in the comments. If you got stuck, drop a question and I will get back to you. And if you want to see part two, where we all connect this stuff to the cloud, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. But thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.